there, I'm Emily, and welcome back. It is my absolute favorite time of year for content. I love watching all the end of year wrap-ups and seeing everyone prepping for the new year. And of course, I love doing all my own prep for next year. So today we're going to set up my 2026 reading journal. The journal I'm using is a B5 from Archer and Olive. It is the Chrysanthemum journal, which was part of their fall collection, but I don't think it's in stock anymore. It's pretty standard in terms of Archer and Olive journals. It doesn't have any special edges or pages or anything, but just has the really beautiful cover and spine designs. Cracking into this journal, I do really quickly want to talk about all the planning that I do for my reading journals. Before I even put pen to page, I'll usually do a whole flip through of my current reading journal and see if there's any spreads in the yearly area that I'm not using, or if there's any issues with the order of the pages. I didn't get rid of too many pages this year, but I did change up the order of all my pages quite a bit. I also went in and sketched all the pages before starting any of my pages because for my theme this year, I'm doing a dragon medieval knight kind of theme, and I wanted to make sure that all of the art felt cohesive. And I also decided I wanted to use tabs for my yearly pages this year since I was switching up the order a bit. So I needed to know how many pages I was going to have and the layout of the pages so I could account for all those tabs. And really quickly, here's a look at some of the planning I do outside of my journal. Even you can see I wrote down all the different pages I wanted to have and a general idea of the layout and moved a couple things around and such. Okay, now that we've thoroughly talked about how much planning goes into even setting this up, let's actually dive into the setup. Last year, I did a semi-Dutch door kind of thing for my intro page onto my page tracker, and I really loved that look, so I decided to do it again this year. I decided I also wanted to add a quote page on the flip side of this because it was kind of just unused space last year, and I'd just read The Six Deaths of the Saint when I was getting this set up, which is very medieval and knight vibes. I absolutely adored it and decided I wanted to use a quote from there. But since I was doing this Dutch door as kind of a set of spreads, I thought it would be really lovely to have these two pages have a similar kind of theme. So the cover page is the sun dragon and the quote page is going to have a moon dragon. Overall for this theme, I knew I wanted the colors to be more muted and not super saturated just to fit in with the vibes. So for this cover page, I used watercolor. I do use a different technique and trick for the rest of the color in this setup, but we'll get to that later. For the pens for pretty much the entire setup, I'm using the Sakura Pigma Micron fine liners. For most of the drawings to keep them consistent throughout, I'm using the 05 for the majority of the lines and the 03 for any detail work. And then for the majority of the titles, I'm using the 08 for the outline and then the 12 to fill in the empty spaces. So for this cover page, going in and doing all the line work for the dragon is the first thing, and then I did the outline for the text as well. For the font for almost every header and title, I'm doing a Lombardic style font, so I used that for the 2026 portion. And then for any subtitles throughout pretty much the whole journal, I'm doing a very tilted and flowy and bouncy cursive with extra flourishy capitals. So I used that font for the reading journal portion of the title in gold. I also decided to use my gold paint pen for the sun behind the dragon. As far as the dragon's coloration, I used a red with a touch of brown undertone in it for the majority of the dragon and used a pale yellow color for the belly and underside areas, and then a light gray for any claws, wing talons, and horns. After all the artwork was pretty much done, it's time to make this into an actual Dutch door. So I'm just cutting out at the line that I identified and then following the wing where it goes past that line. And then the final step here is to take my handy dandy corner rounding tool and round off those corners so that the Dutch door really looks like it belongs. If you don't have one of these, what I used to do was use the scrap paper from where I cut the pages and line up the edges and use that as a tool to cut along to make the rounded edges match exactly what the journal comes pre-cut with. In total, this cover page took about 70 minutes to set up, from touching my pen to the page to erasing all the lines at the very end. Then flipping over, we get to do the companion to this lovely dragon with the quote page. We're starting off pretty much exactly the same as we did on the previous side, just diving right in with the fine liners to do the outline of the dragon. While I work on this bit, I want to quickly talk about some of the measures I'm taking to try to minimize the risk of this journal falling apart as much as possible. I haven't had the best of luck with my larger Archer and Olive journals. The past 2 reading journals I had from them, the cover separated entirely from the pages, and I was going to try and get a notebook therapy journal again this year because that one has held up really well over the past year, but they never shipped my order for over 2 months and didn't respond to any inquiries, so I had to cancel that and give Archer and Olive one last chance before I really dig into finding a different journal company. First things first, I glued the first 2 pages of the journal together. When you get the journal, there's the single-sided dot grid page that is usually the joint between the end paper page and the first booklet of pages within the journal. And this is a weak point if you're using that page and opening it all the time, which is usually fine in the A5s I've found, but I think because of how big the B5 journals are, the glue holding the binding and the end paper together at this point is just not strong enough on its own, and this is where the past 2 journals both fell apart. So I've glued those pages together this time. I'm also using a pretty thick journal underneath the front of the journal whenever I open it to keep the journal from ever bending over 180 degrees open. Most of the time it is open less than 180 degrees, so that in addition to strengthening that joint, I'm also minimizing stress on that joint. So hopefully both of those things keep this journal together for the whole year. Fingers crossed. Okay, back to the quote page. I'm painting the entire moon dragon in this blue-gray color, and then again, all the claws and horns and talons are getting painted gray. For these little stars around the dragon, I did some as fully black, some I did with a silver paint pen, and then one in the dragon's wing I left as just uncolored to kind of look like a little star-shaped hole in the dragon's wing. I thought about making the moon silver paint pen to match the sun on the cover page, but since I'm going to have the quote going over the moon quite a bit, I decided to do it in watercolor, so I'm just using a lighter gray to paint the entire moon and then a slightly darker gray to fill in and blend out the shadows and craters. For the quote, like I mentioned, this is from The Six Deaths of the Saint by Alex E. Harrow, and I decided to do a couple words in the middle and end in the same Lombardic style font that I'm using throughout this setup, and then I'm doing the beginning of the quote in a lighter pale blue in a standard brush lettering cursive, and the middle end part in a slightly darker pale blue in the same font, just to give a bit of distinction between the first part of the quote and the second. Altogether, this spread took me about 65 minutes to set up from pen touch to the end, which I'll just say once all these spreads take a lot of time, and also these times don't include any of the pre-planning and sketching that went into this setup. Now that both of those beautiful art pages are done, it's time to start getting into some of my utilitarian spreads. I always put my page tracker as the very first useful spread in my reading journal because I used it constantly, as you can imagine, with it getting filled in for, I would say, most days of the year. There also isn't a ton of additional decoration for the page tracker setup. Most of the page is taken up by the grid. In case you're curious, each space is 1 dot grid tall and 2 dot grids wide for the grid setup. I also have a little key at the bottom, which each of the page ranges will have a color associated with it, and then each format type has a pattern associated with it. So it ends up looking quite colorful and cool at the end of the year. However, at the time I'm doing this voiceover, I still have not decided what colors I want to use. Please let me know if you have any ideas for colors based on the colors I ended up using throughout. I thought about doing grays, but I did that in 2024, and I really only have enough grays to look distinct for the 5 colors that are on the page tracker, but not enough for the 10 different colors I have to do for the book tracker to represent ratings, and I generally prefer to keep those the same colors, so I don't know. Please let me know if you have any ideas. As with the cover page, my title is using the Lombardic style, and then the month letters are using the flourishy capitals alternating gold and silver. And now we've come to both my best and worst decision for this entire setup. this insane border. I really love it because it looks beautiful and it really ties all the spreads together since a lot of them have this border, but boy oh boy does this border take an eternity to do, so get ready to watch me draw this border a lot throughout this video. Similarly to all the art pieces, I used the 05 fine liner for the majority of the line work, and then for any details I used the 03 fine liner. This border is about 2 dot grid spaces wide on all sides, but for any sides that weren't touching the tab side, it is essentially the space between the edge of the page and the start of the dot grid pattern plus 1 dot grid space. And then I guess this is a good time to talk about the tabs as well. I'm doing 9 tabs across the different spreads. The outer edge of the tab I'm keeping at the edge of the page, so if you look at the journal from the side, the tabs come out to the edge of the pages instead of being indented in at all. And then each tab is 5 spaces wide and 1 space tall, but the top 1 space and bottom 1 space are the diagonal into the non-tab area. And also the first tab and last tab are both 1 space down or up from the top and bottom so that I have enough room to round off all of my corners nicely. And then I'm leaving all my tabs blank while I'm setting the pages up, but I'll come back and label them at the end of the video. Okay, I think that's everything for this page. Even though this page is very simple because of the borders, which I did not do as elaborately and did a tad simpler on the rest of the pages, this page took a whopping hour and 40 minutes to set up. Moving on, we get a brief reprieve from those borders, and we're moving on to my goals page. I didn't do this last year or in 2024, but I had a couple goals I wanted to make sure I hit in terms of the kinds of books I'm reading, and this also has a qualitative element to it where my previous goal pages were much more abstract. For the setup of this page, I essentially split the page that wasn't taken up by the title into 8 equal sections, and then used the 2 most bottom left sections for my artwork, which on this page is a lady knight standing in front of a window. I then set up my goals in the remaining 6 sections, which are all going to be goals that revolve around me reading 6 books of specific types. My 6 goals are to read 6 books from around the world, which is part of a larger goal I'm going to very slowly work towards of eventually reading a book, preferably published in, but at least set in and written by an author from every country in the world, with a few modifications. To read 6 doorbusters, which I classify as any book over 500 pages because I have been woefully lacking in reading book over 500 pages the past year, when I used to read them a lot. To finish 6 series, to read 6 classics, and to read 6 anticipated releases, which are books published in 2026. And then lastly, to keep in line with this theme I'm doing, to read 6 books featuring lady knights. This goal setup essentially has me reading from at least 3 of these categories every month, although I could pick books that cross off multiple prompts. For the 6s and the title of the entire page, I'm of course using the Lombardic font. And then for the goal titles, I'm doing the flourishy style cursive in alternating silver and gold. For coloring in the Lady Knight, I am using a technique which I really love but haven't used in a while, which is to take water-based markers on some kind of palette. I personally am using the acrylic palette I use when I'm doing nail art, but you could also use any other kind of plastic or even just a plastic bag, and then take a bit of water and a paintbrush to pick up the marker color from the palette. This results in really soft colors, but also avoids the patchiness that can sometimes happen with watercolors, and also removes the streaking that you can sometimes get with water-based markers. I really love the way this technique softens the colors up, and I like that I can use my water-based markers because that means I don't have to mix up a bunch of new colors, since my watercolor palette is definitely a lot more limited than the number of Tombow dual brush pens and Crayola super tips I own. This Lady Knight is a redhead, and I mostly stuck to grays and golds for her armor and sword, but also used a green and a dark blue for accent colors. You'll see later on, but I really tried to make each lady night look very different throughout this setup. This spread took me an hour and 30 minutes to set up, the majority of which was spent on the artwork in the corner. Next up is my physical TBR bookshelf. I've been using this spread for so long that I decided I do not need a title for it, and I would just use the whole space for the bookshelf itself. This is also much earlier in the order of my yearly pages than usual, but that is because it usually is opposite the series and DNF's page, but that is instead opposite a Dutch door so that I can have more space for my library savings tracker, because I definitely 100% need 2 pages for that spread, as I have run out of my 1-page spread for the past 2 years, and since the goal page is new and I didn't have anything slated to go opposite it, as all the upcoming spreads are at least 2 pages, I figured rearranging this to be earlier and give me more space for the library would work perfectly. The setup for this is pretty simple. It consists of 3 shelves that are 10 spaces high and almost as wide as the page, with a bit of room for the shelf itself. I then put 12 books on each shelf and just added a touch of decoration to some of the empty spaces. For the top, I decided to make the top of the bookshelf look very stained glass-esque with this rose pattern, and then did a very tiny corner version of the border to fill in that blank space. I used my same water trick with the markers for the stained glass area, and it gave this really nice effect where even if I was using the same color for different pieces of the stained glass, the color varied slightly, which is what happens with actual stained glass. I also used 4 different blues for the background pieces instead of just 1 to really add to that effect as well. As far as colors, I wanted the shelves themselves to be pretty neutral because the books will each get colored in by a different color depending on which month I read the book in. So I just used my darkest gray Tombow Dual brush pen, which looks basically black, for the outline of the shelves, and then a gray for the backboard of the shelves. This page took me an hour and 30 minutes, just like the last page, and again, the majority of this was spent on the artwork and those little borders. Next up, we're getting into the border extravaganza on this page. This is my book tracker spread, which usually takes up 4 pages in my journal because I do a Dutch door with the top and bottom cut off, so I don't have to redo the title and border on each page. To set this up, I'm making 20 rectangles, 7 dot grid spaces tall by 5 dot grid spaces wide on each of the 4 pages, so I have space to document up to 80 books in total across the whole spread. Across the bottom is my key, which is where I will fill in colors for different ratings once I figure out which colors to use. I do an NA color for any rereads, which I don't typically rate, or any memoirs, which I also don't usually give a star rating to. Then I have a space for 1 star through 5 stars with half-star ratings. Each rating will get a different color, and then whenever I finish a book, I'll color the rating in, and then I print out a mini book cover to put in the square for each using my Canon IB printer. Beside the border, this page is super simple to set up, and I'm just using the same font for the title of the page. I will come back later and add some washi tape to the very edge of the Dutch door when I'm doing all my finishing touches at the very end of the entire setup so that the edge of this page is very distinct. But besides that, the entire rest of this setup is me doing this absurd border, which again looks incredible at the end, but takes an actual eternity to do, especially since this border is covering 2 full pages for this one. Now, enjoy some music while I set up the rest of this border. This is tied for the longest setup of this entire journal for a single purpose spread, which is crazy considering how simple the majority of this spread is, but this one took me 2.5 hours to set up. Curse this border. Now we get to take another little break from the borders for a couple spreads, thank goodness. This is my release radar for any anticipated releases. I break this up by month since there's only 4 to 5 days a month that books release on usually, since most books release on Tuesdays. I used to keep just a rolling list that was very unorganized and got out of hand quite quickly, but I've transitioned into using kind of a different area for each month. For the setup, I split each page into 6 boxes, and then I added a header space on the side of each box, which is where the months will eventually go. I decided to alternate where the header is not only on each row, but also across the page break. So the boxes in row 1 on the first page have the header on a different side than both the boxes in the next row on the same page, but also a different side than the boxes in the same row on the next page. I did this mostly to try and avoid lapping the headers with the artwork as much as possible. You'll see at the end, but there is one box where the header overlaps the art. It is a little tricky to read, so I might go back and do like a white outline with paper and then write the header for that one and stick that into the journal, but I haven't 100% decided yet. For the artwork, I wanted to bring in some of the sun and moon elements from my cover page somewhere else in my journal, and since the release radar boxes take up most of the page stuff, and I didn't want to do the border on every single page, I figured this would be a good spread to stick some sun and moon art on the edges. I ended up doing these kind of castle turret type things, and one has a sun in it and one has a moon in it. I wanted to keep these pretty simple, so I didn't end up coloring the turrets in and just used color for the sun and the moon themselves. I, of course, for the sun and moon had to bring back the silver and gold paint pen to keep in theme, and then all of the months for each of the boxes I also did an alternating gold and silver in the same pattern as the side of the box the headers are on. So all the boxes with the header block on the right have the month written in gold, and all the boxes with the header block on the left have the month written in silver. I really love how these little turrets came out, and it might be some of my favorite art from the whole setup. All in all, this page took me an hour and 15 minutes to set up. Moving right along, we're doing some more pages that have a simpler setup. I decided this year to ditch the 20-something in 2020-something. I did 24 in 2024 and failed miserably, and did 25 in 2025 and failed again, although slightly less miserably. And I decided I just didn't like the whole concept really because of how many books it is. Back in 2022 and 2023, I did nonfiction TBRs for the whole year, and I really missed reading more nonfiction this year. And I really liked reading nonfiction that was generally related to any heritage or pride months, so I knew I wanted to bring that back. But I also decided to have a priority TBR, which is somewhat similar to the 20-something in 2020-something, but less books, and these are all from my physical shelves, so this will kind of be a way to read more of my physical books that have been on my backlog for a while, hopefully. The setup is almost identical between these two pages. I just horizontally and vertically flipped them so that the art was in the opposite corners of the pages. Each of the boxes for the covers is the same size as my book tracker, so 5 spaces by 7 spaces. But each box also has a 2-space tall rectangle attached to the bottom. This will be used to color in and write the month when I actually read the book. For my priority TBR, the books I selected are The Book Eaters by Sun Yi Dean, Flood Over Brighthaven by M.L. Wong, A Master of Gin by P. Jelly Clark, A Day of Fallen Night by Samantha Shannon, Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil by V.E. Schwab, We Hunt the Flame by Hafsa Faisal, Kaikei by Vaishnavi Patel, Piranesi by Susanna Clark, Juniper and Thorn by Ava Reed, Minor Detail by Adanya Shibli, Water Moon by Samantha Soto Yambao, and Monstrilio by Gerardo Samano Cordova. The artwork for this side is a nice little sword and a heart, and I of course used my little water-based marker water method again. I also used this gold element of kind of shining lines around the heart. For the border, I used the same very dark gray, almost black I used for the physical bookshelf tracker. On the nonfiction side, I haven't written them in yet because I want to wait until I've finished each book, but I've selected each book based on different heritage and history months. January doesn't really have a distinct heritage month, so for that one, I'm just picking The Gates of Europe by Sari Plaki. February is Black History Month, so I'm reading a Bell Hooks book, and I'm reading The Will to Change. March is Women's History Month, so I'm reading Men Who Hate Women by Laura Bates. April is Arab American Heritage Month, and I'm planning to read Perfect Victims by Mohammed El Kurd. May is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and I'm planning to read Biting the Hand by Julia Lee. June is Pride Month, so I'm reading Ace Voices by Eris Young. July is Disability Pride Month, and I'm reading What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu. August doesn't really have a distinct heritage month, and it is also my birthday month, so I'm just picking a random nonfiction book that seems kind of chaotic and fun to me, which is A Fatal Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum by Emma Southen. Latina Heritage Month is from September 15th to October 15th, so since that spans 2 months, I'm going to do my Latina nonfiction book in September, which is Defectors by Paula Ramos. And I've just realized I put September and October backwards in the order, so I need to fix that, which is pretty easy with the sticker paper. It doesn't really tear away the page at all. For October, I'm reading a horror-ish themed nonfiction, which is Ghostlands by Colin Dickey. November is Native American Heritage Month, so I'm reading By the Fire We Carry by Rebecca Nagel. And finally, December isn't really a distinct heritage month, so I'm reading Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes Demez. For the artwork on this page, we've got another lady knight, but this one is more fancy, I guess, than the previous one. She's not wearing her armor, but she does have a lovely sword. I used my metallic paint pens for a couple of the details, specifically the gold for the star in the center of her corset and the silver for the moon in her necklace. I think I've covered everything pretty in depth on these 2 pages at this point, but the priority TBR took me 45 minutes to set up, and the nonfiction TBR took me 1 hour and 30 minutes to set up since the art was more complex. Getting into the next spread, this is my series and DNF tracker page. This setup is very simple, and again, most of the time on this page was spent on those darn borders. I did just realize I forgot to mention one oddity about my tabs, since this is one of the pages that has it. For 2 of the pages that have a tab sticking out, I did a double tab on one page. So on this page, for example, there's 2 tabs cut out on this same page instead of 1 because I have 2 distinct spreads that will come before the next tab, which is this page for my series and DNFs. And then the Dutch door comes before I would be able to add another tab. The other page I did this for was before my book tracker, so I could on one side of the tab just have 1 tab for my physical shelf and 1 for my book tracker, and on the other side have 1 tab for my goals and 1 tab for my physical shelf. Hopefully that all makes sense. For the DNF tracker, the past 2 years I've done little gravestones, but since I have the border on the top and bottom and didn't want to take up too much room for the DNFs and would rather sacrifice space there than in the series tracker, I decided to just make them little squares where I can write the titles of the books I DNF. I have 10 squares right now, but I've been finding myself more likely to DNF books this past year, especially in the past couple of months, so I might need more space for this. We'll see. If I do need more space, I'll probably just add a little fold out on top of these and add like 20 more squares on that. Anyways, for my series tracker, I just do a simple table with no columns. The header furthest to the left says series name, and I will list all the series I'm in the middle of, and then the header on the far right will say progress, and I'll use an open circle to indicate how many books are in the series, and then I can fill in each bubble once I finish that book. Super simple, super easy to use. I just find it useful so I can actually keep track of what series I'm reading, since I am notoriously bad at finishing them and also even remembering what series I'm in the middle of. I also went in with a light gray marker to highlight every other row in order to make it a little easier to read since I'm not outlining every row. I kind of swapped back and forth around setting up this and the Dutch door and the library savings, but I calculated it out, and just this page with the borders took me 1 hour and 20 minutes, and that includes the time for the center border. Then we get to hop over to this lovely little Dutch door for a brief moment, which is just for adding a bit of art and also for expanding out my library savings spread. This is a princess and dragon to tie into the dragons from the cover page and mix them in a bit with the Lady Knight's medieval theme. I basically just did the outline for this right now and then cut off the outside first because I didn't want to wait for any of the water to dry from when I color this in, so we'll stick a pin in that briefly. For the library savings, the spread is also super simple aside from that excruciating border. I do a table with 4 columns. The first column is just 1 space wide, and that is for the number, so I can number how many books I read from the library in case any books need to go across 2 lines. The second column is the widest, and that is where the book title and author go. Then the third column is for the format, either digital or audio usually. Then the last column is for what the price would have been if I'd purchased the book instead of using the library. For digital and the rare physical book, I compare against bookshop.org if possible, or usually when bookshop.org doesn't have something, it's because they aren't able to sell the ebook. So if the ebook isn't available, I will use Amazon if it isn't on Bookshop. For audiobooks, I use Libro FM for the prices, since that is where I do all of my audiobook listening that's not from the library. And then at the bottom of the second page, I have a thick summary row, which is where I will put the total savings for the whole year. Again, went in with a light gray marker on alternating rows to increase the readability, and did all the column headers in gold with the cursive font I've been using the whole time. This page took 1 hour for me to set up with all of the borders. Jumping back to the Dutch door, I used my same coloring technique. I did a bit more vibrant of a color palette in terms of the princess, just since, you know, she's royalty. And then the dragon I did with reds and browns. I also used my gold paint pen for the princess's crown, but besides that, everything was my little water marker technique. At the very end, I went in with my thinnest fine liner I've been using, which is the 03, and added some sparkles and stars around the page. In total, including the outline before I went to the library savings and for all the color, this page took me an hour to set up. In total, these 3 pages that are kind of all one setup, and I did all at once and jumped back and forth between these 3 pages, took me 3 hours and 20 minutes to set up. And with that, we've reached the very last setup that I'm doing in this video. I did leave myself one more page that I could use for a yearly page if I need to after this, or I can just put in my January intro there, but I haven't decided if I need another yearly page there or not. I just left it in case I see someone do something that really calls to me before the end of the year. Anyway, this last page is my book bracket. In the past, this has been like my second or third page in my yearly pages, but that makes no sense because I always have to flip past it to get to pretty much any of the other pages since I don't fill this in until the end of the year. So I figured I would stick it in at the very end of the yearly pages. I'm keeping the setup for this pretty much the same as last year. Prior to this, I would compare 2 months against each other and then end up with 3 finalists to get to my favorite book of the year, but I liked better if I compare 3 months against each other at the beginning so I can get my favorite book from each quarter of the year as an output as well. And then I just have 2 finalists to compare against at the end. These boxes are sized the same way as my TBR pages and my book tracker, except for the last box for the winner, which in addition to being larger, also gets a bit of decoration as the winner. For the decoration, I did a border using my dark gray marker and then did some little swirly elements in each corner in gold and silver. My final Lady Knight is very stoic. She is very tenderly holding this sword, and I did of course have to tie in a tiny bit of the metallic paint pens. For the silver, she has some tear streaks on her face that I did in silver to make them just stand out a little more. And then the gold, I did this halo shining around her head. I absolutely love her. I think she might be my favorite of all the portraits I did for this theme. And then we get to work on the freaking borders. Now, my deepest apologies. As you can imagine, filming all these hours of setup, my phone ran out of storage and I did not notice when it stopped recording. So you're going to miss about 30 minutes of me doing more borders and then also the line work of the shattered sword on the left of this spread. But not to worry, you get to watch me do the rest of the borders since you definitely haven't seen enough of that already. For all the box titles, I ended up just going exactly what you think I would, which is to do the cursive in alternating silver and gold per row. I labeled all the month boxes and quarter boxes, but left the finalists unlabeled and the winner is unlabeled as well, since it's very decorated already. For the coloration of the Lady Knight and the sword, I toned back down the color palette, so the majority of both of these use different grays for the metal parts, and then the swords have some gold for the handle areas. Then I did some accents using a deeper red and blue for both to make them complement each other nicely, since they're all part of the same spread. In total, including when my camera cut out, this page took me 2 hours and 30 minutes, which is tied with the book tracker for being the longest to set up because of those damn borders. And now we're officially done with all of the setups, but there are a couple finishing touches to get to. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I didn't do labels on any of the tabs while I was setting everything up, so I did that all at the end, first labeling the front side of each, then going back and labeling the back side of each. My one other finishing touch to do was to add some washi tape to the edges of both my Dutch doors. I originally wanted to use some lace PET tape I have, but I could not figure out how to make it work since it's so wide and does not have a straight edge. So instead I used a star washi tape from Amanda Rach Lee's shop. I don't think she sells this one anymore. It's from her very first washi tape drop, but I will link it if she does still have it. So I did that on both the book tracker Dutch door and the Dutch door between the series and DNF page and the library savings pages. In all, the finishing touches took me about 20 minutes to do. And we finally get to flip through this whole thing. I'm so proud of this setup and I'm obsessed with how it all came together. Even though I cursed those borders many times, I really like how it tied all of the spreads together. While I'm flipping through, I am trying to shift the pages around as much as possible so you can see the metallic paint pens as much as possible, since those tend to wash out with the camera and light. In total, this setup took me almost 20 hours, not including any of my sketching or pre-planning, condensed down to a nice 50 minutes for you. Before I release you, please let me know if you have any ideas for my page tracker and book tracker colors. But other than that, thank you so much for watching if you made it all the way to the end. I would love to know what your theme is for the year if you're doing any kind of journaling, and I will see you again real soon.